Hello, welcome to this episode of For Health's Sake, which is all working up, of course, to the Radical Health Festival to be held in June in Helsinki. And today I have a special treat. Today I'm interviewing a patient, a citizen, a person. I'm interviewing somebody who usually is on the receiving end of all the care and all the interventions that healthcare has in mind. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Marie Ennis-O'Connor. Hello, Marie, and welcome.
Hello, Charles. Thank you.
I think it would be really good if you introduce yourself a little in terms of who you are and what you do, just to ensure we're all really up to speed here, because you do so many things.
I do, Charles. I'm a Renaissance woman. So I'm speaking to you today from Ireland. And the reason I say that is because it still kind of blows my mind that I can be in a small corner of Ireland, but yet I can feel so connected to the world and so connected to the future of healthcare and just connected to what's going on. And the reason I say that is it really sets the scene for the work that I do. And so I'm going to have to take you back in time almost 20 years ago now, which I find really, really hard to believe. But 20 years ago, I was a young woman at the time, going about my life, great plans for the future, and then into my life came a diagnosis of breast cancer. And when I say it was life-changing, everybody's going to say it's life-changing, but not only was it life-changing in terms of the health impact on my life, it actually changed the whole direction of my life. And the career that I took. My background is actually in communications, in marketing and science communications. I worked in one of the big universities here in Ireland, and I'd worked a long time in that. But then I got very involved in patient advocacy. Becoming a patient made me see all the things that weren't working in healthcare. And I think that probably why we all get involved with patient advocacy, speaking from a patient point of view, is we see something that's wrong. We see something that we need to change. Quite often it can be a small thing that we need to change. We start working in that area and suddenly it takes over our life. And that has taken over my life for the last 20 years. But it's a very rewarding life. And it's the work that I do. So I call myself a patient advocate. I also call myself an expert patient, I guess, just because it's made my life's work is now in around being a better patient and how that we can work with healthcare to actually improve outcomes.
And, you know, if you have to stop and think for a minute around all the moving parts that are associated with even delivering a diagnosis of cancer, let's talk about cancer today, of cancer, or of any other condition for that matter, but cancer has many more connotations, of course. I think it's surprising sometimes that it works at all, the system, rather than I'm surprised that something is broken, because there are so many moving parts, so many different players, and sadly, or perhaps inevitably, not all people have the same intention and the same script in their mind in terms of how to interact. So I think today it's useful we talk a little bit more about engagement, because this is a word we're using an awful lot more, the importance of patient engagement. But I think before we even talk about engagement, I've always had a little problem being a physician, for whom 20 years ago, by the way, was not quite as distant as it was for you. This word patient, does it fit today? Are we really still patients, or are we citizens, or are we people, or what are we?
People. We are people, and I will slip back into the habit of saying patient, even though it's problematic. And if we look at a word like patient engagement, and if I parse down that to the patient part, we've been debating the use of patient, as you said, for a while now. I guess the thing with patient is, if you called somebody a patient, and I mentioned at the start that I was working in communications, I was this person, I was well educated, suddenly I became a patient, and I became this passive person that lost agency in my own life. That's the problem with that phrase patient. It doesn't recognize an individual as a whole person with multiple dimensions of health and well-being. When you label someone a patient, suddenly that's all you can see. It limits us to this one-dimensional aspect of only receiving care for a specific condition. And the problem with this is that it's resulting in a very fragmented approach to healthcare. It's treating bits of people. So you're treating my
Medicine by body
breast, which
part.
became diseased.
I call it
not me.
medicine by body part because that's really the way Western medicine is now delivered. I'll deal with that part. Somebody else will deal with that part, and nobody deals with you, of course.
Exactly. And this is very, very, very relevant to the conversation. I'm not going to be able to answer that question about what a better word for patient is, because it's very individual. There are many people. In fact, I'm having a very interesting conversation with a group that I'm working with at the moment who don't want to call their condition a disease.
Yep.
And yet there are other parts of the organization that do want to call it a disease because it elevates the science of it. So we shouldn't get caught up in terminology. And I think that's the thing. Some people will want that word. Some people will still want to be a patient. So the terminology doesn't matter. Let's not get caught up in semantics. What's more important is to focus on creating and promoting a culture in healthcare of active participation and partnership, regardless of what terminology we use.
And if we look to
yeah.
the new definitions, Marie, if we look to the management of care for non-communicable diseases, for cancers, we talk about lifelong care. And if we're talking about lifelong care now, it's very, very clear that a process of, again, a term that I absolutely loathe, but it says something, activation of patients into people, perhaps. Let's just use that little moniker for the moment.
Yeah.
Is really fundamentally important, because care cannot be delivered to a passive population. The best way to deliver care is whereby the person receiving it, the person assisting in the receipt of it, are not enjoined and actually co-creators of something else. And I think that whole concept is something which is now becoming much more accepted. Certainly, I've seen a real incredible sea change over my career as a physician. From the situation where it was purely passive to a situation where it's becoming more active. And obviously it's going to become far more active, specifically when we start introducing digital modalities to increase the number of connections, people actually involved in participation, people involved in shared decision-making. But let's go back to activation for a second. I've had experience of trying to activate populations at scale, and it's really quite exciting. I'd like to get your perception of these approaches. What do you feel about it? Do you feel it's appropriate one tries to do this? Do you think it's a little bit too intrusive? Or do you think it has a place?
I do think that has a place. And I'm going to say what I said just previously again, that word, and you alluded to it as well, Charles, that word patient activation, very similar to patient empowerment, patient engagement. They're problematic terms again. And while we don't want to get too caught up in semantics, I do want to just stress that again, that the problem with something like activation or empowerment is that it implies that somebody's actually doing that to you. And so again, just to pick up on what you're saying, true patient activation, true patient empowerment, true patient engagement shouldn't be done to patients, but rather, as you say, co-created with them. So it needs to be a collaborative process, one in which my doctor shares the latest evidence-based clinical information and treatment options with me, but also I think of equal weight as my right to express my own unique needs and individual preferences. Because as patients, we have this inherent power and agency in our own health. And so my great hope for the future of healthcare is that we can activate that power and agency together in some way. And it's a really hot topic, what you're talking about, this question. We've been talking about this for many years. We still haven't come up with a solution quite yet.
Listen, you would expect it to be a hot topic. This is a radical health approach we're talking about. We talk about the hot topics. We talk about the things which are important to people and unresolved. And I know how complex this is, because this whole issue of participation, activation, forget the term, but you know what I'm talking about, is so important. But medical students actually find it quite difficult to grasp. I do a little bit of teaching and it really bothers them. They feel really quite uncomfortable about it, because in many respects it also is associated with the ceding of certain degrees of power and influence and importance, and there's all sorts of other stuff going on. But let me take you to a place which is even more difficult, because that's difficult enough. I'm going to take you to an even more uncomfortable place. And that place is, I'm going to take you to cancer. Now, again, because we started talking about cancer, I'm going to take you to the personalization of care in cancer, which we all know, using molecular genetics, genetic diagnosis, all this sort of stuff. It really is important now that treatment is tailored to individuals, and individuals are participatory in that and engaged and involved in that. We all get that. But we have really skated over one little bit with all the science, and that is shared decision making. Because activating people doesn't necessarily only mean educating them to what is most current, but also means being in a position where one has to accept that sometimes the decision that an individual takes around their care may not necessarily tally with one's perception of evidence, and also one's perception of what's best for the individual. I mean, I remember as a physician having a patient who had, and I'm sorry, I'm going back to old terminology now, having a patient who had prostate cancer that was terminal. He was a wonderful old gentleman, and I knew him for years. And the cancer had got very much worse, really quite suddenly. And the treatment options were all really quite unpleasant. But some of them certainly showed promise and certainly would be the most appropriate thing to do. But his view was that he'd rather go fishing. And I suppose he was right. I don't know who was right and who was wrong. I found it actually quite difficult to accept that, but of course accepted it. But it really is quite challenging sometimes, because especially with precision medicine, of course, one could go and say, look, this is the drug, it will work in your case, it will offer you this and that, and then you say, yeah, but I'd rather go to dinner with my mates. Well, how does one cope with that?
That word agency back in again, and I think that's the real heart for me for shared decision making, is working with patients to understand what's important to them, so their preferences, their values and their goals, and incorporating them into treatment recommendations. So I understand it's a difficult one, and you said, I wonder, was it the right decision? It was the right decision for that gentleman. And I think we talk about molecular diagnosis, this, it's such an important tool in the development of personalized medicine. And I'm so excited by personalized medicine. We talk about 20 years ago, there was no personalized cancer care 20 years ago. It was a blunderbuss approach. You just were, and I was very young at the time, so everything was thrown at me. The toxicity of that treatment, I'm still dealing with now. Just that quality of life completely disrupted for me. So to be able to personalize that treatment now is the most exciting thing that I personally have seen in the last 20 years. And I'm the biggest proponent and advocate of it. But I do think that it adds a further complexity to decision making on behalf of the patient, because there's all these multiple treatment options. The other thing I want to say is we should never forget, and I still have not forgotten what it's like to be that person where I'm catapulted into a foreign land with a foreign language. Words like molecular medicine and personalized medicine just trip off my tongue now, pretty much. But I'm brand new, diagnosed. This is mind-blowing. I mean, I'm in a heightened state. I've just been diagnosed with cancer. I'm barely able to process that. And now I'm being given all these treatment options.
Yeah.
Not
And
so sure there's enough.
these treatment options are complex enough. Before we
Complex. I
even
find
start.
them complex.
Yeah, and getting
Absolutely.
people to understand the different modalities, the different approaches of blunderbuss
Yeah.
treatment, as you call it, to precise treatment, immunotherapy, genetic mutation, effect of genetic mutation upon therapeutic intervention. This is difficult stuff. Most physicians don't necessarily understand it perfectly, so let alone people who aren't conversant with this language all the time.
Absolutely. Well, I wonder, and again, because you brought in medical training medical students as well, there's certainly something around. So we have the science, but there's the humanity side. So there's certainly something around being training for those conversations and how to have them. And that first place to start is not with the science. It's not bombarding somebody with, genetics and molecular diagnosis. It's not that. It's actually starting with what's important to you. So that gentleman who wanted to go fishing, that's important. Now that's where you start. So you start with that conversation, you start with that piece. That to me is that very vital part of shared decision making, of evidence-based medicine. We have the science, but we also have your values, your preferences, and the way that you can live your life as well. We haven't talked about shared determinants of health as well, and how important that this is going to be in this AI future, this wonderful future that we have. We also need to address the barriers to accessing care, because just because we can do these incredible things to personalize healthcare doesn't mean that option is available to me.
Yeah.
And so we need to be cognizant of that as well. You mentioned all the different moving parts of healthcare. We're just starting to see those cogs and those wheels as well underneath.
I'm going to change tack a little bit. And I'm going to talk about a very big event, the pandemic. Not necessarily to talk about the pandemic, but the effect of the pandemic. And the effect of the pandemic is really being seen in a whole host of different places. But I want to hone in on one issue, the personal issue, which you talked about, the importance of the human interaction associated, of course, with the consultation, that interaction between two individuals, that conversation like we're having at the moment, with you being the physician and me being the citizen, or the other way around, it doesn't matter. But I spent many years trying to figure out the best way to have a consultation with a whole host of different individuals who came to see me for assistance and for help. And it's one of the most difficult things to do well. It entails you taking on different personas for different people, especially considering these people so well, if you have longitudinal relationships with them which last over years. And as you become more skilled, you even do things like you have 2 or 3 personas which you change during a consultation. So sometimes you're the father, sometimes you're the son, sometimes you're the mate. And you do that sometimes in 5 minutes. It's very tiring, but incredibly satisfying, because you assist the individual assists you. You're in a position where goodness comes out of it, and obviously better outcomes, which is really all we're interested in. But COVID has changed a few things. We're now really dealing far more in a 2-dimensional world. Now, I would love nothing more than for me to be in the same room with you in some small part of Ireland, to have a conversation with you, because actually I would also see much more of you. And by that, I mean, I would be able to assess far more. Is this person well-groomed? Is she living in a place which is comfortable enough? Can I assess all the other non-health determinants which actually affect her outcome? Is she particularly worried about something which she hasn't talked about? Now, it's going to be very difficult to manage that process on 2 dimensions. It is far more problematic to do that. I can't see if you're wiggling your toes at the moment. I can't see if you're anxiously moving your hands. Now, what's your sense of how are we going to manage this?
Yeah, I don't have the answer for it, but we need to find the answer because that's the way we're moving. Personally, I'm okay with it as a patient. I'm actually very comfortable with online conversations. I can be me. I can talk. I feel it works for me, but I completely understand that it doesn't work for a lot of people, and there's a lot of people that just are not tech savvy, who would not have been able to go on a call with the doctor during the pandemic. A lot of people for whom going in and sitting in a doctor's office is actually life-saving, not just physically, but perhaps mentally as well, life-saving. So we're going to, I don't have the answer, Charles. If I had the answer, that would be wonderful. I don't, but we're going to absolutely have to find the answer. I'm very interested to see the research that's coming out around chatbots in terms of mental health. I mean, that's something that even pre-pandemic had been making quite good strides. And there's quite a lot of good research coming back in terms of CBT. And so there's
particularly from Ireland, I might add. Particularly from Ireland, I might add as well, because there's some very good stuff happening in Ireland.
Yes. Yeah. So we have a precedent set. And so this is what we need to work on. This is, if we talk about radical health, we talk about the radical future. This is the future. This is what we need to find the answers for. This is our future. There is no point in saying, look, it doesn't work. No, we know it doesn't work. But then neither does it work when you've got a doctor's surgery full of 50 people and you can only spend 3 minutes or 4 minutes with them. That system is broken as well. So there's a lot of systems that are broken.
So
yeah, there's a lot of systems.
I totally agree. And there certainly is I think it's understood and acknowledged now, there is a very, very well developed position for video consultation. Absolutely, it's got enormous advantages. I only highlighted a couple of really important aspects of care we need to find solutions for, because they are an integral part of a good conversation, a good consultation, a good interaction between people to enable the individual. At the end of the day, this whole process is for the benefit of the individual to be able to assess what is best for them to take it forward from there. So it's good we ended up on this. I like the fact we did, because in many respects, it really shows us that we have plenty of work to do. Before we finish, is there a last thought you'd like to give us?
Sorry, Charles, I did want to just say this part. It's not the last thought, but the part I wanted to say was, I was really struck by what you were saying, is it was the same argument when EHRs came into the US. Particularly doctors were saying, but I can't actually focus on my patient. I'm not even looking at my patient because I'm here looking at the computer. So I think it's quite interesting that a lot of things that are happening, really, it's just a continuation of what's been happening for a while. And we need to maybe go back a few steps as well and say, well, we didn't fix that. So it's a more global thing that needs to be fixed. So my closing thought, oh my gosh.
It's an iterative process, as you described.
It's one thing that I always actually say, because when we talk about digital health, one of the really important things, and Charles, we touched on it a lot actually in this conversation, both from your point of view as a physician and me as a patient, we talked about the person. And so if we talk about the molecular diagnosis, and we talk about personal health, and we talk about personomics and genomics, the really important thing is that we never forget the person. So the personomics, part of that mix, is actually at the heart. So if we talk about shared decision making, we talk about personal health, really what we're talking about is that person who's sitting in front of you. How can you help them not just to get well, but to live the best life that they can live? And the only person who can really tell you what that looks like is the person themselves. So never forget the analog person and the analog in among all the digitization of healthcare in the future. And so if I was ever to leave a parting shot or a closing thought, it's always going to be never forget the humanity at the heart of healthcare.
Yep. And there's always a place for fishing. You're absolutely correct.
Place for fishing, absolutely. Or whatever floats your boat, whatever you want to do. How can you help that person to have another day's fishing, another good day's fishing or whatever? Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for that.